I'm here to talk to you about my thesis, which is titled The Spaces of the Dark. My thesis centers around deriving game narrative from uncommon sources and using level design techniques to recreate the emotional experiences found in other forms of media. As a note on my high concept, just to remind you, I wanted to recreate the experience of living one of my favorite poems, which is Rhapsody on a Windy Night by T.S. Eliot. I want to look at what elements of a poem are essential to preserve when considering how the poem is read, and then of course how it will play in a playable space. I also want to utilize level design techniques to create a specific emotional landscape that mirrors the emotional landscape of the poem, and then also sort of explore how games can derive inspiration from unique and uncommon sources. Movies have been using books, plays, even songs like Bohemian Rhapsody as inspiration for years, and I think there's a lot of potential for games to do the same thing. So when I began this semester, I had one big question in mind, which is, how do you turn a poem into a playable space? What I found is that there are a lot of steps involved in this process. The first is poetry analysis. I need to look at the poem and find out 4 things. 1, I need to myself analyze it and figure out what's going on a literal level. What is the sort of core loop of the poem? 2, I need to analyze the deeper meaning, the poetic meaning, what the author is trying to say in Rhapsody on a Windy Night. 3rd, I need to look at prevalent images and recurring sort of conceits and metaphors to see what T.S. Eliot might have been trying to get at with the images he was using. And then 4th, I want to compare my analysis of Rhapsody on a Windy Night with professional analysis to make sure I'm not completely off base in the way I'm designing and the things I'm thinking. So, my results from this part of my research are as follows. In a literal sense, I discovered that the poem chronicles a man's journey home along the reaches of the streets, so to speak, of Paris at night. Secondly, the poem's structure and flow, the images the author chooses to use, and his sort of insistence on repeating certain images and creating a dialogue between the reader and these weird street lamps who are along the streets are meant to replicate the experience of slowly losing one's mind. The poem is highly structured at the beginning, decently structured at the end, and in the middle is kind of this weird Eliot-esque slog through recurring images and things like that. As far as those recurring images go, I discovered that sentient street lamps that converse with the reader, the moon, flowers, the time of night, the sea, and people in distress were all important recurring images in the poem. And then based on looking at literary sources from my university undergrad, as well as sites like Shmoop, I discovered that on the whole, the literary community agrees with my analysis of Rhapsody on a Windy Night. So, now that I had taken the poem into consideration and looked at it as its own thing, I needed to look at what elements of the poem could become a game. So there were 4 things here I needed to consider too. 1, which aspect of the poem is most important to emphasize? What do I need to preserve in order to create the same emotional experience in my level that reading the poem creates in readers? Secondly, how will the player hear the poem? Of course, in a level based on a poem, you need to be able to hear the poetry to understand what's going on. Thirdly, how can I translate the images and the feelings from Rhapsody on a Windy Night into game mechanics, and also, on a high level, into a level layout? And then, of course, 4th, how do other games that focus on creating anxiety and fear do it? Horror is a huge genre. It's been around for, a long time, and I wanted to look at how the experts were doing it and see what best practices I could learn and then implement in my design. What I discovered is that the things I should preserve are mostly the primary narrative, the setting, and the speakers and characters. So I need to have a level that is set on the streets of a city at night and that features a human person and sentient street lamps they are conversing with. Secondly, I want to preserve the dialogue between the speaker and the sentient lamps because it informs how the player will hear the poem. Parts of the poem, which are not heard in the street lamp's proverbial voice in Eliot's poem, will be heard in my voice. And then the other parts of the poem that are heard in the street lamp's proverbial voice in Rhapsody on a Windy Night will be heard in a weird, backwards, sort of synthesized version of my voice that is meant to emulate and replicate the experience of talking to a sort of alien, bizarre street lamp. I looked at game mechanics. I saw how street lamps can become protective checkpoints, the time of night can be used to cue visual changes, and then the moon could maybe be used as a goal or a landmark. And then I looked, of course, in more depth at horror games. These games, I discovered, use lighting, sound, and layout in a lot of really interesting ways to create feelings of anxiety and unease. I then, after I sort of did this high-level research, went into more detail. I started by looking at my game, and then tried to find games that did what I was doing and see what I could learn from them. So what do I know about my project? I want to create a horror game. I want to use sanity as a mechanic. I want to use shifting audio and visuals to help bring forth emotional moments. I want a contrast between light and darkness, and then I need a linear level because poetry is linear. So I started looking at what games do these things. The first game I came up with, mostly as a reference for sound, but also as a reference for sanity as a mechanic, is Amnesia: The Dark Descent. It uses sound to control the player's emotional state. When the player does or sees or experiences something bad, they are cued with a bad sound. Notably, in this game, it's the sound of the character's teeth grinding, but at certain points, they also hear things like distorted church bells, odd whispering voices, their name being called from places that it shouldn't be, things like that. And then when the player steps into light, those things are cleared and go away. So that's the way that they use sanity as a mechanic, and I decided to sort of echo that mechanic too. Secondly, I looked at lighting. The Silent Hill series, of course, is an excellent example of a horror series. It's one of the most notable, it's well known, it's well lauded, things like that. So I looked at how Silent Hill Downpour, the upcoming game, as well as the original games, used lighting to draw the player forward through the horror levels. Horror obviously makes people nervous and anxious. People are instinctively afraid of the dark, and so this game makes really great use of light to draw the player forward. You don't want to be in the dark. You're more vulnerable in the dark. Instinctively, you don't want to be there. And so having lights at a distance will automatically draw the player forward if they feel enough fear and anxiety. The game also makes excellent and iconic use of fog to control what the player sees, which is something I intend to do also. Layout was a really interesting one for me. I discovered that horror games use layouts in a ton of different ways. A lot of times, a feeling of disorientation contributes to a feeling of anxiety, and so finding a horror game that has linear levels was a little bit more interesting. What I landed on was Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly. In this game, you have to hold up a camera in order to kill the ghosts, essentially. The camera drastically reduces the player's field of view and their ability to see in front of them. And so the designers of this game chose to set Crimson Butterfly in a Shinto-style environment. Shinto houses are known to have this really geometric and linear structure to them, and so this was a really useful tool that they did in, basically you have a mechanic that reduces your player's visibility and ability to see, and they created level layouts that don't get in the way of that. So, then looking at my work so far. I started with a paper map. This map is actually the size of a full poster board, and this is about a third of it. It is what my level looks like now. So I went through, started at the beginning, timed out exactly how long it takes to read each line of the poem as I'd broken them up, and spaced them along the map. You can see those little black circles represent the sort of trigger points, which are, important for when the player hears the poem. I also wanted to make something linear, but with a little bit of that disorientation feeling, and so I landed on the idea of these kind of alleyways or side streets, the sort of U-shaped box streets that you see. It's very true to how Montmartre in Paris, the neighborhood I based this on, is structured, and it's also just, a good practice, because you can't actually get lost because everything leads the same way, but if you feel like going off the beaten path, you can do that a little bit. Like I said, I timed out the poem. I timed out each line, how long they would take, as you can see on this chart here, and then I went back to my paper map, did the math, and made sure, based on my character's speed in Unity, how often they would hear the poem and where they would hear lines of the poem. Then my next step was, of course, to build up my city. My level is set in a city at night, so I found a really excellent asset pack to work with. If you check out my gameplay video, you'll see the assets in action. They look really, really nice. I laid out my streets according to my LDD, tested that. When I was happy with how often and where the player was hearing pieces of the poem, I added the buildings in, as you can see in that lower image. It was quite a time sink. And then, of course, I added my interactables, audio triggers, street lamps, visual triggers, things like that. I scripted all the functionality for those, so currently I have a very solid working prototype. Now I'm incorporating best practices. So this was my next step after I built everything. I wanted to look at how I could sort of incorporate what I'd learned. The lighting changes along with the mood of the poem. It's what the player is hearing affects what they're seeing. There are times, for instance, where Eliot talks about the ocean and everything gets very blue, and so the player is kind of drawn into that weird state of like, am I in the ocean, am I not? It also drives the player forwards because lamps, which are your only sort of checkpoints or markers to keep you from going insane, go out after you've encountered them. The player hears both environmental and scripted sounds, depending on where they are in the level. Of course, they also hear the poem read, too. And then, like I mentioned, the layout is linear. As you can see, it is primarily linear with some little derivations off to the side if the player feels like exploring. So what's next? I need to record better audio because my audio debug is okay, but I would like to improve it more. I would also like to incorporate post-processing volume and lighting shifts throughout the poem to match moments of tension. I have a scripted version of this right now, so the functionality is there. It's about form now. I want to look at studying color theory further and how I can use that to help me make the player feel more anxious and desperate at certain points in the poem. I'm going to then, of course, do a lot of playtesting, a lot of asking my target audience what they think, a lot of asking my peers what they think, polishing, and then documentation. I've got a pretty solid LDD now, but I think I could always write more about my process, the best practices I'm using, and then, of course, my own analysis of the poem. Here are my references. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great winter break.